The Suicide Squad is written and directed by James Gunn, who a lot of you will know from the Guardians of the Galaxy movies over at Marvel. He's crossed over to DC for at least one movie, and I'd like to share my thoughts on that movie. And before I start talking about this movie, I will reference the first Suicide Squad quite a bit during this review, just because as I was watching this one and as I've been kind of reflecting on it afterwards, I can't help but just kind of compare the two. So I guess this is kind of a spoiler warning for the first Suicide Squad. I won't go too much in depth, but just as a heads up, you'll hear me talk a lot about the first one in this review. This movie acts sort of as both a sequel to the first Suicide Squad movie, but also as sort of a reboot. And what I mean by that is there are elements of this movie that carry over from the first Suicide Squad movie, specifically some of the characters, but a lot of the storyline does not. Like in this movie, they do reference a little bit of the first Suicide Squad movie. They do reference some of the events from the Harley Quinn movie, Birds of Prey. But other than that, for the most part, this movie is filled with completely different characters. And you could have not even seen the first Suicide Squad movie and be able to watch this one and know what's going on. For example, the opening scene in this movie is Amanda Waller trying to gather up some convicts, and she's really quickly explaining the deal like, I need you to help me with this mission. If you succeed, you get 10 years off of your sentence. If you try to escape, then I'll blow your head off. In this movie, that scene takes about 30 seconds to a minute. In the first Suicide Squad movie, that scene took about 10 minutes. It had a lot of heavy lifting to do at the beginning. So if you've seen the first Suicide Squad movie, it's really nice because we don't need that all explained to us again. But if you haven't seen it, it's a really quick and easy entry point. They don't need to do all this exposition explaining like what's going on. It's just, here's the deal and here's how it's going to go. So it's a sequel in that, you know, if you've seen it, you know what's going on, but it's also a reboot where if you haven't seen it, you can just jump right in and understand what's happening. I want to talk about some of the characters in this movie for a little bit. As I said, there's only a few characters that carry over from the first one. There's Harley Quinn, played by Margot Robbie, who continues to crush it in this role. I felt like in the first Suicide Squad movie, that was basically hers and Will Smith's movie, him as Deadshot. They had to do a lot of, like, it was their origin story almost. They had to do a lot of the heavy lifting in that movie. And then we already got another Harley Quinn movie, Birds of Prey, like I said. So it was nice that she continued to, you know, excel in this role, but that she wasn't the focus of the movie. She was great, but like in the first Suicide Squad movie, every time she wasn't in a scene, I felt that the movie sort of dragged a little bit. But in this one, in scenes when she wasn't in it, the movie was still very entertaining and very engaging. So she was kind of like a role part in this movie, but still continued to do great, which I really liked. Idris Elba plays Bloodsport, who is more or less the same thing as Will Smith's Deadshot in the first one. He's this guy who any weapon or any object really that he finds, he becomes like an expert marksman and really deadly with it. John Cena's character is kind of the same. You know, he picks up a weapon and is like an expert at it. And they do reference that a lot in the movie, how they pretty much have the same abilities, and they throughout the movie kind of try to one-up each other, which I really appreciated their chemistry. And speaking of chemistry, I first of all think that all of the actors were perfectly cast in this movie. There wasn't a single role that felt like miscast. Everyone felt natural in their roles. And every single character had chemistry with one another. And this is a big ensemble cast. Like if you look at the movie poster or if you've seen any of the trailers, there's a lot of people in this movie, and it can be hard for them all to have chemistry with each other. But I felt that every single character had chemistry with every single other character. There weren't any interactions that felt weird. Everything felt natural, and I just felt like everyone really worked well. All the characters kind of meshed in this movie. But where I think this movie really excelled was that it was free from the burden of having to fit in with a previously established movie universe. The first Suicide Squad came out when Warner Brothers was still trying to make the DC universe a thing, and so they kind of had to shoehorn in some storylines and some characters and plot points from the other movies to remind you that this is all part of an extended universe. As much as I don't mind Jared Leto's Joker, he was totally unnecessary in the first Suicide Squad movie. They only put him in there, I think, because they hadn't had a Joker in that franchise yet, and they kind of just messed up by not having him be in any of the Batman movies. So he just kind of felt shoehorned in. But in this movie, like I said, it does act as a sequel. Like this does take place, I think, in the same universe, but it's like it's separate. It's its own thing. It's free of having to connect to the other movies. It was almost like Warner Brothers just said to James Gunn, listen, you have some parameters, but for the most part, just do your thing, make a good movie. And he did. This movie is R-rated, and it is very R-rated. The violence in this movie is brutal and abundant, which the first movie did not have. And I think when you have a group of, somewhat shady characters, they should resort to brutal violence sometimes. Like the first one was PG-13, and the most we got was like Will Smith mowing down a bunch of just faceless zombie beings. In this one, you get some really creative and really brutal fatalities that you couldn't get in a PG-13 movie. So again, just being free of having to fit in with other movies, that worked to this movie's advantage. Again, speaking of being free of any sort of burdens, this movie was much more vibrant than any of the other DC movies that I've seen, except for maybe Aquaman. The colors just really popped. Like in the first Suicide Squad movie, the colors are all kind of dulled down. Not to diss on Zack Snyder's Snyderverse, which I still kind of want to come back, but all the movies in that kind of universe were all kind of like muted. They, what was on screen was nice to look at, but color-wise, it didn't really pop. This movie, every scene is colorful, the colors are vibrant, and it's just really nice to look at. So again, being free of having to fit in with something, this movie really stood out in that way. With all that being said, I didn't feel like this movie was that different from the first Suicide Squad movie. It's similar in that it's like kind of hyper stylized. There's like text graphics on the screen that pop up, like in this movie when they're transitioning from kind of one like plot to kind of like the subplot. There'll be they'll find some way to have text on the screen that says like meanwhile, but it's like part of the environment sort of. So it's like kind of hyper stylized in that way, but is just better executed than the first one. That's kind of the best way I can put it. This is what the first Suicide Squad could have been, but it's just better executed and free of having to fit in with anything else that made this movie really excel. Two more things I want to talk about real quick. I want to talk about the finale of this movie without getting into spoilers. So, going back to the first Suicide Squad movie, that finale with the Enchantress was silly and awkward, and I thought really like ridiculous, with her channeling her inner Shakira for the whole thing, just with her hips and her CGI brother or whatever. It was ridiculous, and it was not well executed. I just didn't enjoy it very much. The end of this movie is ridiculous. What you see on screen is very much out there. It's like pretty unbelievable, but it's executed well. From a action standpoint, it's way more entertaining. From a comedic standpoint, it's a lot funnier. But it also hits, I think, the emotional beats a lot better. There's some really good emotional interactions between some characters during the finale that the first one didn't have, that this one did have. So again, just overall, this movie, it was just better executed than the first one. The only tiny issue I had with this movie, which I've been noticing I've been having with a lot of action and superhero movies, is some of the hand-to-hand combat is a little bit stiff. So like when two characters are fighting, and if one character like punches and the other character dodges, naturally you would think the other character would try to like pull away and like reload for the next punch or whatever. But what's happened in this movie, and as like I've noticed in a lot of other movies that don't have the best hand-to-hand combat, the character will like punch or strike with a knife or whatever weapon they have, and they'll hold it there for just like a split second too long that it seems unnatural, so that the other person can like grab it or snap it or break it off or whatever. It's just like for a split second too long where you can tell that it's very choreographed. And that was the only thing that I noticed in this movie. There were a couple of scenes where, like I said, a guy will punch and he'll hold his hand there for just a split second too long so the other guy can do his like counter move, whereas naturally, it would be like a quick punch. So that's really the only complaint, and that's really it. Like nothing else in this movie. There was nothing else in this movie that I really didn't mind. Overall, just some closing thoughts. This movie is what I think a lot of people wanted from the first Suicide Squad movie, but didn't get because it had to fit in with what Warner Brothers was doing at the time with the DC universe. It's just a better executed version of that movie and rated R. It's like I said, I've used this term a lot. It's free of the burden of having to fit in with other movies. It can just do its own thing, and that really served this movie well. Alright, so The Suicide Squad, have you seen it? If so, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to stay tuned for more.